May 31st, 1889, Johnstown, Pennsylvania. At around 4:07 in the afternoon, a wall of water 40 feet high slammed into a town of 30,000 people with almost no warning at all. It had been building for over a decade, 100 million tons of water held back by an earthen dam that a group of the richest men in America had quietly weakened year after year for their own private pleasure. When it finally gave way, it took less than 10 minutes to kill more than 2,200 people. But here's what almost nobody knows about the Johnstown flood. The dam didn't fail because of some unforeseeable act of nature. It failed because a private hunting and fishing club, owned by some of the wealthiest industrialists in the country, had spent years quietly altering it, lowering its height, blocking its spillway, removing its discharge pipes, to build a road and stock a private lake with fish. Engineers had warned them. Residents downstream had warned them. Nothing changed. And when the water finally came, not one member of that club would ever be held legally responsible for what happened. This is the full story of the deadliest man-made disaster in American history before the 20th century, and the disaster that changed the law itself. To understand what happened at Johnstown, you first need to understand the strange geography sitting above it. 14 miles upstream, in the hills above the town, sat Lake Conemaugh, an artificial lake roughly 2 miles long, created by an earthen dam originally built in the 1830s and 1840s as part of a state canal system. By the 1850s, the canal system it once served had become obsolete, replaced by railroads, and the dam was largely abandoned, falling into disrepair for years. In 1879, a group of wealthy industrialists from Pittsburgh purchased the dam and the lake above it, forming the exclusive South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club. Its membership list reads like a who's who of Gilded Age America. Among them, Henry Clay Frick, the steel and coke magnate, and Andrew Carnegie, who at the time was building the steel empire that would make him one of the richest men who ever lived. The club rebuilt the dam not as flood infrastructure, but as a private amenity, a resort lake for wealthy families to sail, fish, and vacation on, ringed by elegant cottages and a clubhouse. Here's the detail that would prove catastrophic. In renovating the dam for their private use, the club made a series of modifications that, individually, seemed minor, but together fatally weakened the structure. They lowered the top of the dam by several feet to widen the road across it for carriages, reducing its margin above the waterline. They installed fish screens across the spillway to keep their stocked game fish from escaping, screens that would later trap debris and restrict the flow of floodwater trying to exit. And most critically, they had removed the discharge pipes and valves that previous owners had used to control and lower the lake's water level in an emergency, since replacing them was expensive and the club had little use for them in ordinary operation. Engineers who inspected the dam in its altered state raised concerns. A civil engineer connected to the Cambria Iron Company, the massive steelworks located directly in Johnstown below, reportedly warned the club directly that the modifications had compromised the dam's safety. Local newspapers in Johnstown ran occasional stories expressing unease about the structure looming above the town. The warnings were, by most accounts, treated as an annoyance rather than an emergency. The club's wealthy membership had little daily contact with the working-class town in the valley below, and little incentive to spend money reinforcing a dam that, in ordinary weather, held perfectly well. Johnstown itself, meanwhile, was a booming industrial town of nearly 30,000 people, built largely around the Cambria Iron Company, one of the largest steel producers in the country at the time. It sat at the confluence of two rivers in a narrow valley, a geography that made it prosperous for industry and catastrophically vulnerable to any flood coming down from the hills above. May 28, 1889. a massive storm system. One meteorologist would later describe as one of the heaviest rainfalls ever recorded in the region up to that point, began moving across the central United States. By May 30th, it had settled directly over the mountains of western Pennsylvania. Overnight into May 31st, rain fell in astonishing quantities. Some estimates placed the total rainfall at 6 to 10 inches in under 24 hours across the region, an amount that would overwhelm modern flood infrastructure, let alone an aging 19th century earthen dam already weakened by years of unauthorized modification. Rivers and creeks throughout the valley were already swollen and overflowing well before the dam itself was in any serious danger, flooding parts of Johnstown's low-lying streets in the early morning hours of May 31st. A flood that, on its own, would have simply been a bad but survivable spring storm. At Lake Conemaugh, the club's engineer and a small crew watched the water level rise with mounting alarm through the morning of May 31st. Workers desperately tried to clear debris from the fish screens clogging the spillway, and even attempted to dig a secondary channel to relieve pressure on the dam. It wasn't enough. The lake, already swollen far beyond its intended capacity, kept rising. Here's one of the most tragic details of the entire disaster. Riders were dispatched from the club down the valley toward Johnstown to warn residents that the dam might fail. Telegraph lines, critical for spreading urgent warnings quickly across the valley's string of small towns, had already been knocked out by the storm in multiple places. Some warnings that were sent were not taken seriously. Residents of the valley had heard rumors of the dam's fragility for years without incident, and many had grown numb to the warnings. The same psychological trap that would repeat itself in disaster after disaster for the next century. At 3:10 p.m. on May 31st, the South Fork Dam finally gave way completely. What followed has been described by survivors and later engineers less as a flood than as an explosion. Roughly 20 million gallons of water per second burst from the breach, unleashing the entire contents of Lake Conemaugh, an estimated 14.55 million cubic meters of water down the narrow valley toward Johnstown in a single catastrophic surge. The wave tore through the small towns of South Fork, Mineral Point, East Conemaugh, and Woodvale before it ever reached Johnstown itself, growing larger and more destructive as it went, absorbing houses, trees, railroad cars, livestock, and people into a churning, debris-choked wall of water and wreckage. At East Conemaugh, a passenger train was caught directly in the flood's path. An engineer aboard one of the trains, seeing the wave approaching, tied down his train's whistle and drove his locomotive forward through the rail yard, specifically to warn people ahead, sacrificing his own chance to escape in order to buy others time. Many credit his warning with saving dozens of lives in the towns immediately downstream, even as the flood itself claimed others just moments later. By the time the wave reached Johnstown itself, at approximately 4:07 p.m., it was estimated to be moving at speeds up to 40 miles per hour, carrying a wall of debris, collapsed houses, uprooted trees, twisted rail cars, barbed wire from a wire factory it had obliterated upstream that acted almost like a battering ram ahead of the water itself. Survivors who lived through what happened next consistently describe it not as water rising, but as a roar, a sound many compared to a freight train or distant thunder, growing louder by the second, moments before the wave itself became visible. Those who saw it coming had, at best, a minute or two of warning. Most had none at all. The wave struck the town with a force that flattened entire blocks instantly. Houses were lifted off their foundations and smashed against each other, sometimes multiple structures compacting into a single mangled mass of wreckage, with people trapped inside as they were carried, spinning through the flooded streets. Survivors described clinging to floating rooftops, furniture, even sections of collapsed buildings, as they were swept for miles through the churning debris field, watching neighbors and family members disappear beneath the water around them. In less than 10 minutes, a significant portion of Johnstown had been reduced to churning wreckage. Perhaps the single most horrifying chapter of the entire disaster occurred at the Pennsylvania Railroad's stone bridge at the edge of town, a sturdy stone arch structure that, unlike the wood frame buildings around it, actually held against the force of the flood. But that strength became a trap. As the flood's debris field, houses, trees, rail cars, and an estimated hundreds of victims, some alive and pinned, some already dead, slammed into the upstream side of the bridge, it created a massive logjam that piled up to nearly 30 feet high across a stretch of river covering some 30 acres. Then, as evening fell, the debris pile caught fire, likely ignited by overturned coal stoves or lantern oil carried along in the wreckage. The fire burned through the night, and an unknown number of victims who had survived the flood itself, trapped alive in the tangled debris and unable to free themselves, died in the flames at the bridge. It remains one of the most horrifying single details of any disaster in American history. People who had survived being swept for miles through a flood, only to die by fire while trapped in the wreckage that had just saved them from drowning. When the water finally receded and the fires burned out, the death toll stood at more than 2,200 people, making it, at the time, one of the deadliest disasters in United States history. And it would remain the deadliest single-day loss of civilian life in the country until the September 11th attacks, over a century later. 99 entire families died together, with no survivors left to identify or bury them individually. 396 children under the age of 10 were killed. 1 in 3 victims, over 750 people, were never identified at all, their remains buried in a section of Johnstown's Grandview Cemetery that came to be known simply as the Plot of the Unknown. The disaster destroyed an estimated 1,600 homes and caused property damage equivalent to well over $400 million in today's dollars. Clara Barton, founder of the American Red Cross, arrived personally to lead relief efforts, one of the organization's first major disaster responses, and a defining early moment in establishing the Red Cross as a national disaster relief institution. Here is the detail that turned Johnstown from a natural tragedy into a national scandal, and one that still gets taught in law schools today. In the aftermath, it became widely known and reported that the South Fork Fishing and Hunting Club's modifications to the dam, lowering its height, blocking its spillway with fish screens, removing its emergency discharge pipes, had directly contributed to its catastrophic failure. Survivors and the families of victims sued the club and its individual members. Every single lawsuit failed. Under the legal doctrine of the time, the flood was classified as an act of God, a legal category that shielded the club from liability, regardless of the modifications they had made, since courts of the era were reluctant to assign personal financial liability for what was framed as a natural catastrophe, especially against defendants as wealthy and well-connected as Carnegie's Circle. Not one member of the club, including Frick and Carnegie, ever paid a cent in compensation to the survivors or the families of the dead. The public outrage over this outcome became one of the most significant catalysts in American legal history for the shift toward the modern doctrine of strict liability, the legal principle that a party can be held responsible for damages caused by inherently dangerous activities, like maintaining a large dam, regardless of whether negligence can be individually proven. Johnstown didn't just kill 2,200 people. It permanently changed how American law thinks about corporate and private responsibility for catastrophic risk. Anna Fenn Maxwell, a local midwife, was swept from her home along with several of her children. She survived by clinging to floating debris for what witnesses described as hours, though tragically, several of her own children did not survive the flood alongside her. a loss she carried for the rest of her life while continuing to serve as a midwife and caregiver to the town's survivors and their next generation of children in the years that followed. Victor Heiser, a teenager at the time, escaped the flood by climbing to the roof of his family's barn as the wave hit, watching his own parents swept away and killed in the water below him. He would go on to survive the disaster and later become a prominent physician, dedicating much of his career to public health work, partly, he would later say, shaped by what he witnessed as a boy in Johnstown. The unnamed railroad engineer at East Conemaugh, who tied down his train's whistle and drove forward through the yard to warn the towns ahead of him, is remembered, even without a widely recorded name in most retellings, as one of the clearest acts of self-sacrifice in the entire disaster, choosing, in the last minutes available to him, to spend them warning strangers rather than saving himself. Here's a detail that rarely makes it into shorter retellings. In the years leading up to 1889, the South Fork Dam had actually sprung leaks on at least a few prior occasions during heavy rain, each time patched hastily with mud, straw, and whatever loose material was on hand rather than being properly reinforced. Local farmers and residents in the small towns strung along the valley below, South Fork, Mineral Point, East Conemaugh, had grown up hearing half-joking, half-serious warnings that the dam is going to break someday, passed down almost as local folklore. That kind of repeated, unresolved warning is part of why, when riders finally did come through on May 31st, shouting that the dam had actually failed, some residents reportedly hesitated, assuming it was just another false alarm like the ones before it. It's a pattern disaster researchers still study today. The more times a warning is issued without consequence, the less power it has the one time it won't. It's worth pausing on exactly what made Johnstown itself such a uniquely deadly place for a flood to strike. The Cambria Iron Company wasn't just the town's main employer, it was one of the largest and most technologically advanced steel producers in the entire United States at the time, having been among the first American companies to successfully mass-produce steel rails using the Bessemer process. The mill complex itself sat directly in the flood's path, and the wave tore through it, hurling loose barbed wire from an adjacent wireworks into the debris field that would go on to snag and injure survivors trying to swim or climb to safety elsewhere in the wreckage. In a grim irony, the very industrial success that had built Johnstown into a boomtown worth flooding through in the first place also filled the floodwaters with some of the sharpest, most dangerous debris survivors would have to fight through. Amid the chaos of failed warnings, one story stands out for the opposite reason. A telegraph operator at South Fork, upon realizing the dam was failing, stayed at her post, sending warning messages down the line to towns and railroad stations ahead of the flood for as long as the lines remained functional, even as the water approached her own location. Her warnings are credited with giving some townspeople in the flood's path just enough extra time to reach higher ground before the wave arrived. It's a quieter, less cinematic act of heroism than a locomotive engineer driving into danger, but arguably just as consequential. A reminder that some of the most important acts during a disaster happen at a desk, not in the water. News of the disaster spread with unusual speed for 1889, largely because journalists flooded into the region within days, drawn by the sheer scale of the death toll. Newspapers across the country ran front-page coverage for weeks, and the disaster became one of the first in American history to generate a genuinely nationwide, sustained wave of charitable donations. Money, clothing, and supplies poured in from all over the country, and even internationally. Donations arrived from as far away as Great Britain, Germany, and even a notable contribution from the Russian Empire. In total, an estimated $3.7 million was raised for relief in 1889, an enormous sum for the era, equivalent to well over $100 million today. It marked one of the first times that a natural disaster in the United States triggered what we would now recognize as a modern, coordinated national relief response, setting a template that would shape how the country responded to disasters for generations afterward. Johnstown rebuilt, and Cambria Iron Company's steel industry continued to anchor the town's economy for decades afterward. But the flood permanently altered the town's identity. It became, and remains, most widely known not for its steel, but for the disaster that struck it in 1889. Remarkably, and grimly, Johnstown would go on to suffer two further major floods, in 1936 and in 1977, cementing an unusual and tragic reputation as one of the most flood-scarred towns in American history. Today, the Johnstown Flood National Memorial, run by the National Park Service, sits at the site of the former South Fork Dam, preserving the breach and the remains of the club's grounds as a permanent reminder of what happened. The Plot of the Unknown in Grandview Cemetery remains, still marking the graves of the hundreds of victims never identified. The Johnstown flood exposed something that the country had never fully had to confront before at this scale: that private wealth and industrial power could quietly reshape public risk for thousands of people who had no say in the decision, and that existing law had no real mechanism to hold that power accountable when the worst happened. The dam didn't fail because of bad luck. It failed because it had been built, quietly and legally, to serve the comfort of a few dozen wealthy families, at the expense of an entire town's safety. More than a century later, the doctrine born out of Johnstown's tragedy, that some risks are too dangerous to excuse, no matter how wealthy or powerful the party creating them, still shapes how American courts decide who pays when catastrophe strikes.